The silence in the cottage was a fragile thing. It was made of the soft puff of breath from little Sarah, asleep in her cradle, and the whisper of the evening breeze through the lavender bushes by the window. Eleanor Vance held the quiet close, as if it were a blanket. Grief had hollowed out their small home, leaving echoes where her husband's laughter used to be. Now she filled the emptiness with small rituals: the mending of a shirt, the slow stirring of a thin soup, the gentle stroking of her daughter Maya's hair. Maya sat beside her on the worn wooden floor, her head resting against Eleanor's arm. At 7 years old, she understood loss as a sudden quiet, a space at the dinner table that was never filled. Her older brother Leo was 10. He sat by the hearth, poking at the low fire with a stick, his shoulders set in a way that was too old for him. He was trying to be the man of the house, trying to fill the enormous shoes left behind by his father Thomas. Eleanor's heart ached every time she saw him square his jaw that way. It was Thomas's expression, a look of stubborn determination. Eleanor's fingers found the small, tarnished silver locket she always wore. Inside was a tiny, fading portrait of Thomas, his eyes crinkling at the corners. On the other side was a lock of Leo's baby hair. It was her world, past and present, contained in a cool piece of metal. She squeezed it tight, the edges digging into her palm. The pain was a small, sharp reminder that she was still here, still breathing, still a mother. 3 months. It had been 3 months since the logging accident. 3 months since the world had tilted on its axis and thrown her into a cold, unending twilight. The air in the cottage smelled of wood smoke and drying herbs. Sunlight, weak and golden, struggled through the small, clean window panes, illuminating a million dancing dust motes. Eleanor watched them, mesmerized. Thomas used to say they were tiny bits of magic, visible only to those who looked for them. She had no time for magic now. She had only 3 children to feed and a future that was a vast, terrifying fog. "Mama," Maya whispered, her voice muffled against Eleanor's sleeve. "Are you sad?" Eleanor forced a smile, turning to cup her daughter's face. Maya's eyes, the color of a stormy sea just like her own, were wide with concern. "I am always a little sad without your papa," she said softly. "But I am never sad when I have you, and Leo, and Sarah. You are my happiness." She kissed Maya's forehead, a fierce and desperate love surging through her. This was all that mattered, keeping them safe, keeping them together. Leo looked over from the fire, his expression serious. "We'll be all right, Mama. I can get more work down at the miller's. He said I'm strong for my age." Tears pricked Eleanor's eyes, her strong, brave boy. "I know you are, my love," she said, her voice thick. "But you are still a boy. Let me do the worrying." The quiet returned, but it was different now, heavier. It was the quiet of a shared burden. Sarah stirred in her cradle, making a soft cooing sound. Eleanor watched her, a small, perfect being untouched by the sorrow that clung to the cottage walls. For her, for all of them, she had to be strong. She had to find a way. They had a little money saved, enough for another month, maybe 2 if they were careful. After that, she refused to think about after that. One day at a time. That's what she told herself. Just get through today. A sudden heavy knock on the door shattered the air. It was not a neighbor's friendly rap. It was a hard, impatient sound, the kind that demanded entry. Leo jumped to his feet. Maya pressed closer to Eleanor, her small body trembling. Eleanor's heart began a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. She placed a reassuring hand on Maya's shoulder and rose to her feet, her own legs feeling unsteady. "Who is it?" she called, her voice barely a whisper. "Silas Croft," a low, gravelly boom answered from the other side. "And the town bailiff. Open the door, Eleanor." Eleanor's blood ran cold. Silas Croft, the wealthiest landowner in the county, a man known for his burly frame and his even harder reputation. Thomas had worked for him on occasion, but they had kept their distance. Croft was not a man you wanted to owe anything to. She smoothed down her faded dress, took a deep breath, and slowly unlatched the door. Silas Croft filled the entire doorway, his bulk blocking the last of the evening light. He was a large man with a florid red face and small, calculating eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He was dressed in expensive work clothes, a stark contrast to the worn simplicity of her home. Behind him stood the bailiff, a thin, quiet man, whose presence made the situation feel official and ominous. The smell of horses and cheap ale from the tavern drifted in with them. "Croft," Eleanor said, trying to keep her voice steady. "What is this about?" Silas's lips curved into a smile that held no warmth. It was a predator's smile. "Business, Eleanor. Unfinished business." He pushed past her into the cottage, his heavy boots scuffing on the clean floor. He glanced around the sparse room, his gaze lingering on the children with an expression that made Eleanor's skin crawl. The bailiff followed him in, looking uncomfortable, his eyes fixed on the floorboards. "My children are here," Eleanor said, her voice dropping, a protective edge creeping in. "Whatever this is, it can wait." "Oh, I think not," Croft said, turning his attention back to her. He seemed to enjoy the fear in her eyes. "In fact, this is very much about the children." He pulled a folded document from inside his coat. The parchment was thick, the ink dark and severe. "Your late husband, Thomas, was a man of many secrets, it seems." Eleanor stared at the paper. Her mind refused to understand. "Secrets? What are you talking about? Thomas was an honest man." Croft let out a short, cruel laugh. "Honest? He was a debtor, a significant one." He unfolded the document with a loud crinkle, holding it out for her. "2 years ago he came to me, needed a substantial loan, said it was for a new start, an investment. I gave it to him, and he signed this." Eleanor's hands trembled as she took the paper. The legal language was a confusing jumble of words, but she saw the sum at the top. It was an impossible amount of money, more than they would see in 10 lifetimes. And at the bottom, in his familiar steady hand, was Thomas's signature. A wave of dizziness washed over her. It couldn't be. Thomas would have told her. He would never have hidden something like this. "This is a mistake," she whispered, shaking her head. He would have paid it. He just needed time." "He ran out of time," Croft said flatly, "and the debt remains, a debt I have come to collect." "I have no money," Eleanor said, the words tasting like ash. "You know that. We have nothing." "Not nothing," Croft corrected, his eyes flicking toward Leo and Maya, who were huddled together near the hearth. "You have assets. According to this contract, an old but perfectly legal piece of law, I might add, if the debt cannot be repaid with coin, it can be repaid with labor. Indentured servitude." The phrase hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Indentured servitude. The words made no sense. They were from another time, from dark stories told to frightened children. This was their life, their home. "You can't," Eleanor began, her voice cracking. "You can't be serious." "I am as serious as a heart attack, Eleanor," Croft sneered. "The contract is ironclad. Thomas Vance pledged his assets as collateral, and in the absence of property or funds, his children are his assets." A strangled cry escaped Eleanor's throat. She looked from Croft's smug face to her terrified children. Leo's face was pale, his small fists clenched at his sides. Maya was crying silently, tears streaming down her cheeks. Eleanor felt a rage so pure and hot it nearly blinded her. She took a step forward, the contract crushed in her hand. "You will not touch my children," she hissed, the words torn from the deepest part of her soul. "They are not property. They are not for you to take." Croft actually chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that filled the small room with menace. "It's not up to you, it's the law. The bailiff here is my witness. The debt is due, you cannot pay. Therefore, the collateral must be surrendered. To me." "Why?" Eleanor pleaded, the anger giving way to a desperate, gut-wrenching despair. "Why are you doing this? It's just money. We can try to pay you back, a little at a time. I'll work. Leo will work." "Because I can," Croft said, his voice dropping to a low, vicious tone. "And because your husband thought he could outsmart me. He made a promise he couldn't keep. This is a lesson, a public one. People need to understand what happens when they fail to honor their debts to Silas Croft." His malice was a physical thing, a cold presence in the room. This wasn't just about business. This was personal. He wanted to break her. He wanted to make an example of them. The bailiff finally looked up, his face etched with a reluctant pity. "Mrs. Vance," he said quietly, "the contract is legal, Mr. Croft has filed a claim with the magistrate. I'm, I am sorry, I'm just here to serve the notice. He pulled another paper from his own coat. This one was simpler, a single sheet with stark black printing. Croft stepped back, a triumphant look on his face, as the bailiff moved to the cottage door. Eleanor felt frozen, trapped in a waking nightmare. She could hear the small, frightened breaths of her children. She could smell the lavender from the garden, a scent of a life that was being ripped away from her. She watched, helpless, as the bailiff took a small hammer and a single nail from his pocket. The first tap of the hammer was like a gunshot in the quiet room. Sarah woke with a start in her cradle and began to cry, a high, piercing wail of distress. The sound broke through Eleanor's paralysis. She rushed to the cradle, scooping her baby into her arms, holding her tight against her chest, turning her back on the men as if she could shield her family from this horror with her own body. Tap, tap, tap. 3 solid strikes, the sound of their doom being nailed to their front door. Croft smirked. There, it's official. The auction will be held in the town square. He savored the words. Your children's indenture will be sold to the highest bidder to cover what your husband owed me. He let that sink in before adding, and I assure you I will be the highest bidder. He turned and strode out of the cottage without another word, leaving the door wide open. The bailiff lingered for a moment at the threshold. He wouldn't meet Eleanor's eyes. He simply looked at the notice he had posted, then down at the floor. When? Eleanor asked, her voice hollow, rocking Sarah, who would not stop crying. The bailiff cleared his throat. He looked at her then, and for a second, she saw a flicker of genuine human sorrow in his eyes before it was extinguished by duty. Next Tuesday, he said, his voice barely audible. High noon. Then he too was gone, leaving Eleanor standing in the middle of her ruined life. The evening air felt colder now. The sounds of the town, once a comforting backdrop, now seemed menacing. For a long time, she just stood there holding her crying baby, with Leo and Maya clinging to her dress. Her mind was a roaring void. Finally, her legs began to move. She walked like an old woman, each step an effort. She went to the door and looked at the piece of paper nailed to the wood. The ink was black against the white page, stark and brutal. Public notice, auction of indenture. Her eyes scanned the words, but they swam before her. Debt. Thomas Vance, collateral. Leo Vance, age 10. Maya Vance, age 7. Sarah Vance, age 1. Their names listed like livestock. Their futures to be sold for a handful of coins. The world tilted and spun. The sounds of her own children's weeping seemed to come from a great distance. The only thing that was clear were the final words from the bailiff, echoing in the silent spaces of her shattered mind. Next Tuesday, high noon. She reached out a trembling hand and touched the rough paper. It was real. This was happening. Her gaze drifted past the notice, to the splintered wood of the door around the nail. It looked like a fresh wound. She stared at it, the auction notice a declaration of war on her family, and felt the last fragile pieces of her world crumble to dust. The splintered wood of the door shuddered under the force of the nail. Eleanor did not move. She simply stared at the crude white paper, a death warrant for her family, tacked onto the heart of her home. The bailiff's voice, flat and devoid of pity, still echoed in the sudden silence. Next Tuesday, high noon. The words were a brand on her mind, searing and permanent. The world outside the small cottage window continued as if nothing had happened. A bird sang its evening song. The wind rustled the leaves of the old oak tree Thomas had planted when their first son Leo was born. It was an impossible contrast. Her world had ended, yet the world itself kept turning. Finally, her limbs unlocked. She stumbled back from the door, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a sob that clawed its way up her throat. Her children, Leo with his father's serious eyes, Maya with her wild, curious spirit, and little Sarah, whose world was still nothing more than warmth and milk and the circle of her mother's arms. The thought of their small hands being led away, their frightened faces looking back at her, was a physical agony. It hollowed her out, leaving nothing but a cold, howling wind where her heart used to be. No, she would not let it happen. She would not. There had to be a way. Thomas could not have left them with nothing. He was a careful man, a loving man. He would have put Something aside, a secret stash for an emergency. This was an emergency. This was the end of all things. Her grief, a constant, heavy shroud for the past 3 months, was suddenly burned away by a desperate, frantic energy. It propelled her across the small room, her eyes scanning every corner, every shadow, as if the answer might be hiding in plain sight. Her gaze landed on the small, dark wood chest at the foot of their bed. Thomas's chest. It held the few things he had considered truly his own. He kept it locked, not out of secrecy from her, but out of a quiet, personal sense of order. The key was exactly where he always left it, hanging on a small nail behind a framed drawing Maya had made of their family. Her fingers trembled as she took it down. The metal was cool against her feverish skin. Kneeling on the floorboards, she unlocked the chest. The lid creaked open, releasing the faint, familiar scent of cedar, worn leather, and her husband. It was a scent that brought a fresh wave of grief, so powerful it almost knocked her over. For a moment, she just breathed it in, her eyes closed, pretending he was just in the other room, that he would walk in and see her distress and wrap his strong arms around her. He would tell her everything was all right, but he was not in the other room. He was in the cold ground, and a monster was at their door. She pushed the feeling down, forcing herself to focus. Money. There had to be money. Her hands, clumsy with panic, began to sort through the contents. On top was his spare work shirt, folded neatly. She lifted it, pressing the rough fabric to her face. Underneath lay a small, worn, leather-bound book. It was not a ledger. It was a collection of poems he had loved, the pages soft with use. She remembered him reading to her from it on long winter nights, his voice a low, comforting rumble by the fire. She tossed it aside. It was useless. Next came a small canvas pouch. Her heart leaped. It was heavy. It had to be coins. She fumbled with the drawstring, her breath catching in her throat. She tipped the contents into her palm. Not coins, river stones. Smooth gray stones he had collected from the banks of the river where he had proposed to her. One for each year of their marriage. 7 of them. They felt cold and heavy in her hand, like the weight of her new reality. A choked sound escaped her lips, a mix of a laugh and a sob. Of course. He had saved memories, not money. Deeper in the chest, she found a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. They were her letters, the ones she had written to him when he had taken a short-lived job in a logging camp before they were married. Her own words, full of hope and youthful love, now seemed to mock her. There was nothing else. No hidden compartment, no false bottom, just the simple, cherished remnants of a simple life. A life that was about to be torn apart because it had been built on a secret, terrible debt. She sat back on her heels, the empty chest before her like an open wound. The frantic energy drained away, replaced by the cold, heavy certainty of doom. He had left them nothing, not a single coin to stand between his children and indentured servitude. The love she felt for him warred with a bitter, rising tide of betrayal. How could he? How could he have been so reckless, so blind? How could he have signed such a document, knowing what it could mean? She clutched the silver locket around her neck, the one that held his tiny portrait. Looking at the smiling face within, she could not sustain the anger. She only saw the kind man she had loved, the man who must have been cornered, desperate and ashamed. He had tried to fix a problem and in doing so had created a catastrophe. The last light of day was fading outside. The cottage grew dark, the shadows deepening. She heard a small stir from the children's room. Soon they would wake, hungry and wanting their mother. How could she face them? How could she look into their innocent eyes, knowing the fate that awaited them? There was one last hope, a place of sanctuary and mercy. It was a thin hope, a threadbare one, but it was all she had left. She pushed herself to her feet, her joints aching. She would go to the pastor. The man of God would have to help her. He would not let this injustice stand. The walk to the town church felt like a pilgrimage of shame. The air was cool and the first stars were appearing in the deep blue sky. Usually the quiet streets of Blackwood at dusk brought her a sense of peace. Tonight, every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every curtain that twitched in a window felt like a prying eye. She could feel the whispers already starting, the news of her ruin spreading like a contagion through the small community. Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, bowing her head as if to ward off the stares, both real and imagined. The pastor's home was attached to the church, a modest but well-kept stone building with light glowing warmly from the windows. For a second, standing before his door, her courage failed her. She was about to lay her family's deepest shame at his feet, to beg for a charity she knew he likely could not provide. But the image of Maya's face, tear-streaked and confused, flashed in her mind. She raised a trembling hand and knocked. Pastor Michael opened the door himself. He was a kind-faced man in his late 50s, with gentle eyes that were already full of concern. The news had clearly reached him. "Eleanor," he said softly, his voice full of a sad resignation, "please come in." He led her not into the formal parlor, but into his private study. It was a small room, lined from floor to ceiling with books. It smelled of old paper, leather, and beeswax from a single candle burning on his desk. He motioned for her to sit in a worn armchair by the unlit hearth while he poured her a cup of chamomile tea. She accepted it, though her hands were shaking so badly she was afraid she would spill it. She set the cup down on a small table, untouched. "The bailiff was here," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "He brought a notice from Silas Croft." The pastor sighed, a deep, weary sound. He sat down opposite her, his hands clasped between his knees. "I heard," he said. "I am so sorry, Eleanor. It is a terrible business. A cruel business." "Is it legal?" she asked, the question feeling foolish as soon as it left her lips. "Can he truly do this? Can he take my children?" Pastor Michael looked away for a moment, his gaze falling on a large, leather-bound Bible on his desk. "The contract is an old form," he explained, his voice heavy. "It draws on archaic laws most of us thought were long dead and buried. But it is, I am afraid, technically legal. Thomas signed it. His signature is the seal on the matter. Silas Croft is within his rights, legally speaking." He stressed the word legally as if to separate it from any moral right. "But it is not right," Eleanor insisted, a note of desperation creeping into her voice. "They are children. They are my children. There must be something the church can do. Is there no fund, no collection we could take up? The debt is $500. It is a fortune, I know, but if the whole town—" The pastor held up a gentle hand, his expression pained. "Eleanor, $500 might as well be 5,000. The people in this town are good people, but they are not wealthy. Most are farmers, barely making ends meet themselves. Many of them are in debt to Silas Croft in some small way or another. To stand against him publicly would be to invite his wrath upon themselves." The hope that had carried her to his door began to crumble. "So they will do nothing? They will just stand by and watch him sell my children?" "They will pray," the pastor said softly. "I will lead them in prayer. We will pray for a miracle, for Mr. Croft to have a change of heart." Eleanor stared at him, the untouched teacup, the rows of silent books, the well-meaning, helpless man before her. Prayers. They were offering her prayers. She felt a cold, hard anger crystallize in her chest. It was not anger at the pastor, but at the powerlessness he represented. Her children were being led to the slaughter, and the town's response was to kneel and ask God to intervene. "A change of heart?" she repeated, her voice flat and empty. "Silas Croft has no heart, Pastor. He has a ledger and a pen, and he uses them like a sword. Prayers will not stop him." She stood up, her body feeling stiff and old. The brief sanctuary of the study now felt suffocating, a quiet tomb of useless words. "Thank you for the tea, Pastor," she said, the polite words tasting like ash in her mouth. She did not look at him as she walked to the door. "Eleanor, wait," he called after her, his voice full of genuine distress. "Do not lose faith." She paused at the door, but did not turn around. "Faith did not sign that contract, Pastor," she said quietly. "My husband did, and Faith will not pay his debt." She pulled the door open and stepped out into the night, leaving the man of God standing alone in his room full of books. The second door had closed. There was only one left, one final, desperate, humiliating option. If mercy could not be found in the house of God, perhaps it could be begged for at the house of the devil himself. She would go to Silas Croft. She would throw herself at his feet. She would beg. She would plead. She would offer him anything she had. Her pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. All that mattered were her children. The next morning, Eleanor rose before the sun. She left a small breakfast for the children and a note for Leo, telling him to watch his sisters and that she would be back soon. The lie felt heavy on her tongue. The walk to Croft's farm was long, nearly 2 miles out of town. The road was dusty, and the rising sun was already beginning to beat down. Her simple dress was already sticking to her back by the time she saw the sprawling expanse of his property. Croft's farm was not a farm. It was an empire, a vast green kingdom built on the sweat and debt of others. A pristine white fence stretched as far as the eye could see, enclosing fields of healthy crops and pastures dotted with fat, contented livestock. The main house was a large, 2-story structure with a wide porch, painted a brilliant white that seemed to mock the sun. It was a monument to wealth and power, designed to make anyone who approached feel small and insignificant. It was working. She found him near one of the large barns, directing a group of workers. Silas Croft was a big man, burly and red-faced, his expensive work clothes stained with the honest dirt he paid others to toil in. He held a leather riding crop in one hand, tapping it rhythmically against his thigh. He saw her approach but made no sign of acknowledgement. He continued to bark orders at his men, forcing her to stand and wait, a supplicant ignored, while the sun climbed higher in the sky. The smell of hay and manure was thick in the air, a rich, earthy scent of prosperity that made her own small, struggling homestead feel even more pathetic. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he dismissed his men with a wave of his hand. They trudged off, careful not to meet her eye. Only then did he turn his attention to her. His small, calculating eyes raked over her worn dress and tired face, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his lips. "Eleanor," he boomed, his voice dripping with false cordiality. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Come to admire the place. This is what a well-run operation looks like, not like that pathetic little plot your Thomas left behind." Eleanor flinched at the mention of her husband's name, but she forced herself to stand tall. "Mr. Croft, I've come to talk to you about the debt." "The debt is a matter for the town bailiff, not for me," he said, turning as if to walk away. "The arrangements have been made." "Please," she said, her voice cracking. She took a step forward, her hands clasped in front of her as if in prayer. "Please don't do this. They are just children. My children." Croft stopped and turned back to her, his smile gone, replaced by a look of cold amusement. "They are assets," he corrected her. "Collateral on a loan your husband foolishly took and failed to repay. He was a weak man, Eleanor, always dreaming, never planning. He wanted to buy that extra field, thought he could compete with me. He bet against the house, and he lost. Now the bill is due." Tears began to well in her eyes, hot and shameful. "I will pay you," she pleaded, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "I will work for you, for the rest of my life. I will work your fields, clean your house. I will do anything. Just let me pay it off myself. Let me keep my children." He let out a short, harsh laugh. What use are you to me? You're one person. Your indenture wouldn't cover half the interest. But your children? They are young. They have years of good, hard work in them. A boy to work the fields, a girl for the kitchens, and the little one, well, she'll grow. It's a much better return on my investment." He was talking about them like livestock, like pieces on a game board. The coldness of it was more terrifying than any open rage. This was not about money for him. She could see it in the gleam in his eye. It was about power. It was about the humiliation of her family. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, the tears now streaming freely down her face. "You have so much. We have nothing. What is the point of this cruelty?" He took a step closer, his large frame blocking out the sun. He lowered his voice, the gravelly tone meant for her alone. "Your husband thought he was my equal. He stood against me in the town council over that bridge proposal 10 years ago. He rallied people against me. He cost me money. I don't forget things like that, Eleanor. I want everyone in this town to see what happens when you cross Silas Croft. Your Thomas made his bed. Now his children get to lie in it." The final piece clicked into place. This was not business. It was vengeance, a petty, long-held grudge against a dead man to be paid by his innocent children. The last flicker of hope died within her. There was no mercy here. There was no humanity. There was only the hard math of power and revenge. She stood frozen, the tears drying on her cheeks, leaving her skin feeling tight and raw. She had nothing left to offer, no words left to plead. She had emptied herself out at his feet, and he had simply stepped over her. Croft seemed to enjoy her silent despair for a long moment. He looked her up and down one last time, a dismissive sneer on his face. He then gestured vaguely toward the main gate with his riding crop. "Go home, Eleanor," he said, his voice returning to its booming, public tone, "and get the children cleaned up for the sale. We wouldn't want them looking shabby on the platform, would we? Presentation matters." He turned his back on her and walked away toward his grand white house without a second glance. A moment later, one of his workmen, his face a mask of grim reluctance, walked over and pulled the heavy wooden gate shut. The loud, definitive sound of the latch clicking into place echoed across the yard. It was the sound of the last door in the world slamming in her face. The gate shutting in her face was a sound that did not end. It echoed through the sleepless night, a sharp, metallic finality that punctuated every frantic beat of her heart. Croft's words were worse. "Get the children cleaned up for the sale." The phrase had slithered into her mind, coiling around every thought, poisoning every memory, cleaning them up, as if they were livestock, as if they were nothing more than property to be presented, polished for a buyer. Eleanor had not slept. How could she? Sleep was a luxury for the hopeful, a refuge for those who believed tomorrow might be better. For her, tomorrow was a cliff edge, and the sun was about to rise. The first light of Tuesday was not a gentle dawn. It was a thief creeping through the thin curtains of the cottage, stealing the last few moments of darkness that had served as a fragile shield. The light was gray and cold, the color of ash and old bones. It touched the worn floorboards, the simple wooden table, the three small beds where her children still slept, their breathing soft and even. For them, it was just another morning. For Eleanor, it was the end of the world. She sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a cup of cold water. She had no intention of drinking. Her body felt hollowed out, a fragile shell of a person. All the tears she had cried over the past days had left her empty, dehydrated of everything but a cold, hard dread. She watched the dust motes dance in the pale shafts of light. Each tiny particle seemed to her a ghost of a happy moment, a speck of flour from a time she and Maya had baked bread, laughing as they covered the kitchen in white powder, a fleck of dried mud Leo had tracked in after a grand adventure in the woods, his face beaming with pride, a tiny fiber from a blanket she had wrapped around a sleeping Sarah, her heart swelling with a love so fierce it was a physical ache. Now these motes just looked like the dust of a life turning to ruin. The quiet of the cottage was deafening. It was the silence of a held breath, the pause before a scream. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, Eleanor rose from her chair. Her joints ached with a weariness that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with a soul stretched to its breaking point. She walked to the small wooden chest at the foot of her bed. Her hands, usually so steady when mending a tear or stirring a pot, trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside were the children's best clothes. Best was a relative term. They were simply the least worn, the most carefully mended. She had spent half the night with a needle and thread, her fingers numb, her eyes burning, reinforcing a seam on Leo's shirt, patching a small hole near the hem of Maya's dress. Each stitch was a tiny act of defiance, a desperate, hopeless prayer. "You will not take them," looking neglected, her heart had whispered to Silas Croft in the dark. "You will not have that satisfaction." She laid the clothes out on her own bed, Leo's brown trousers and pale blue shirt. The shirt was a hand-me-down, once belonging to a neighbor's son, but she had washed it with lavender until it smelled of home. Maya's dress was a faded cornflower blue, the color of her eyes. Thomas had bought her the fabric for her 4th birthday. He had held it up against her small face and declared she would look like a summer sky. Eleanor's throat tightened, a familiar knot of grief and love. And for little Sarah, a simple white smock, mended at the collar with threads so fine the repair was almost invisible. Looking at the 3 small sets of clothes laid out like offerings, a wave of nausea washed over her. She gripped the bedpost, her knuckles white, and forced herself to breathe. In, out, in, out. Just get through the next minute, she told herself. Then the one after that, Leo was the first to stir. He sat up in his small cot, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He was 8 years old, with his father's serious expression and a quiet awareness that was sometimes unnerving. He looked at his mother, at the clothes laid out on her bed, and his brow furrowed. "Mama, are we going somewhere special?" he asked, his voice still thick with sleep. The word special was a dagger in Eleanor's heart. She forced a smile, a brittle thing that felt like it might crack her face. "Yes, my love," she said, her voice a strained whisper. "We're just going into the town square for a little while." The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. Leo's gaze was steady. He knew her, this boy of hers. He knew the shape of her real smiles, the sound of her true laughter. He must have sensed the falsehood, but he was a good boy, a protective older brother. He simply nodded, a silent acceptance that asked no more questions, and for that, she was both grateful and heartbroken. She helped him dress, her fingers fumbling with the buttons on his shirt. Her touch lingered on his shoulder, the feel of his small, bony frame beneath the clean fabric. He was growing so fast. He was all angles and limbs, on the cusp of leaving boyhood behind. The thought that his growth, his future, might happen under another roof, under the command of another person. No, she pushed the thought away with a violent internal shove. She could not afford to break. Not yet. Not in front of them. "There," she said, smoothing his collar. "You look so handsome. Just like your father." Leo gave her a small, shy smile, and for a fleeting second she saw Thomas looking back at her. The resemblance was so strong it made her chest ache. Next was Maya. She woke with a sweet yawn, her dark hair a tangled mess around her face. At 6, Maya lived in a world of stories and daydreams. She saw the clean dress and her eyes lit up. "My blue dress. Are we going to the fair, Mama?" she chirped, scrambling out of bed. "Will there be music? Will you buy me a ribbon for my hair?" Each innocent question was a fresh torment. Eleanor felt her composure begin to fray. A fair, music, ribbons, all the simple, beautiful things she could no longer give them. All the things Silas Croft was stealing from them. "Maybe, sweet girl," she managed to say, her voice tight. "We'll have to see. Now let's get you ready." She turned Maya around to fasten the dress, hiding her face for a moment, blinking back the hot tears that threatened to fall. She could not let them see her cry. Their world was already so fragile. Her strength was the only thing holding it together. If she shattered, they all would. Little Sarah was last, woken by her siblings' voices. She was only 3, a bundle of soft cheeks and trusting eyes. She didn't ask questions. She simply held her arms up to Eleanor, her universal signal to be picked up. Eleanor scooped her into her arms, burying her face in the warm, sweet-smelling curve of her daughter's neck. Sarah's solid weight was an anchor in the swirling chaos of her mind. She held her for a long moment, memorizing the feel of her small body, the way her tiny fingers curled around a lock of Eleanor's hair. She dressed Sarah in the white smock, a task that was blessedly simple, blessedly normal. Sarah gurgled happily, patting the clean fabric. She had no idea, thank God, she had no idea. With all 3 children dressed, a strange, terrible silence fell upon the room again. They looked clean and neat and loved. They looked like 3 beautiful children ready for a Sunday service. But the air was thick with unspoken fear. Leo stood silently by the window, staring out at the gray morning. Maya fidgeted with a loose thread on her dress. Sarah sat on the floor, babbling to a small, carved wooden bird Thomas had made for her. They were ready, ready for the sale. The thought made Eleanor's stomach clench so hard she had to press a hand against it. "Maya, come here," Eleanor said, her voice softer now. She pulled a stool into the center of the room. "Let me do your hair." Maya climbed onto the stool, her back straight and proud. Eleanor picked up a worn wooden comb. This was a ritual they both loved. Every night before bed, Eleanor would brush and braid Maya's hair for the morning. It was a quiet time of connection, of soft murmurs and gentle touch. But this morning, the simple act felt sacred and profane all at once. Her hands began to move, parting the dark, silky strands. 1, 2, 3. She began the familiar pattern, her fingers weaving the braid. Over, under, cross. A rhythm as old as time. A mother's hands caring for her child. With each pass, a memory surfaced. Thomas, watching them one evening, a soft smile on his face. "You have your mother's hands, Eleanor," he had said. "They can fix anything. She could fix a torn seam. She could fix a scraped knee. She could fix a broken toy. But she could not fix this. She could not fix the crushing weight of a dead man's debt." The braid grew longer, tighter, a perfect orderly plate against the chaos in her soul. She could feel Maya's warmth, smell the clean scent of her hair. She focused on the sensation, on the simple mechanics of the task. It was the only way to keep the black tide of panic from pulling her under. Her fingers were moving, but her mind was screaming, "This might be the last time. The last time I get to do this. The last time I feel her hair in my hands." The thought was so sharp, so painful that she flinched, pulling a strand too tight. "Ow, mamas," Maya murmured. "Sorry, my love," Eleanor whispered. Her voice choked. "So sorry." She loosened her grip, her movements becoming infinitely gentle, almost reverent. She finished the braid, her fingers stroking the end of it for a moment before tying it with a small piece of twine. There were no ribbons. She ran her hand over Maya's head, a final lingering caress. "There, wife, beautiful." Maya hopped off the stool and ran to show Leo, her braids swinging behind her. Eleanor watched her go, her hands still tingling with the memory of her daughter's hair. Her heart felt like a clenched fist in her chest. It was time. There was no more delaying, no more small tasks to hide behind. The sun was higher now, its gray light filling the small cottage. She could hear the town beginning to stir, the distant clatter of a wagon, the bark of a dog. High noon. The bailiff's words echoed again. They had to go. She walked to the hearth and took the small silver locket from the mantelpiece. It was tarnished and worn, her most precious possession. She opened it. On one side, a tiny painted miniature of Thomas, his smile kind and a little bit crooked. On the other, a tiny lock of Leo's baby hair, as pale as corn silk. She snapped it shut and hung it around her neck, tucking it beneath the collar of her dress. The cool metal against her skin was a small, cold comfort, a reminder of what she had lost and what she was about to lose. She knelt down so she was at eye level with her children. She gathered them close, pulling them into a tight circle of her arms. Leo resisted for a moment, his 8-year-old pride warring with his need for comfort, but then he leaned into her. Maya and Sarah burrowed against her, their small bodies soft and trusting. Eleanor closed her eyes and inhaled their scent. Leo's faint smell of soap and outdoor air. Maya's sweetness, like wildflowers. Sarah's milky baby smell. She tried to burn this moment into her memory, the weight of them, the warmth of them, the perfect, unique reality of them. "This is my world," she thought, "my everything." "Listen to me," she said, her voice low and urgent, but steady. She had to be steady. "We are going to the town square. There will be a lot of people there." She felt Leo tense in her arms. "We are just going to sit for a while on a bench, and I need you to be very brave and very quiet. Can you do that for me?" Leo nodded solemnly against her shoulder. Maya looked up at her, her blue eyes wide with confusion. "Why, Mama?" Eleanor's carefully constructed composure almost broke. "Why? Because your father made a terrible mistake. Because a cruel man wants to own you. Because the world is a dark and heartless place." She could not say any of that. "It's just something we have to do today, my love," she said, stroking Maya's cheek. "But I want you to listen to me very carefully. Look at me." She made sure all three of them were looking into her eyes. She held their gazes, pouring every ounce of love and fierce devotion she possessed into that look. "No matter what happens today," she said, her voice shaking just a little, "no matter who talks to us or what anyone says, you remember this. I am your mother, and I will never, ever leave you." It was a promise, but it felt like a desperate gamble. She did not know how she would keep it. She had no plan, no weapon, no hope. But as she said the words, she knew she meant them with every fiber of her being. She would die before she let them go. She would tear the world apart with her bare hands. The promise was not a lie. It was a declaration of war against fate itself. She held them for another minute, a silent, frantic prayer screaming through her mind. Let this be a dream. Let me wake up. Let Thomas walk through that door and tell me everything is all right. But the door remained closed. Thomas was gone, and Silas Croft was waiting. With a deep, shuddering breath, she released them. All right, she said, her voice a ghost of its normal self. It's time to go. She stood up, her legs feeling unsteady, like a newborn foal's. She took Leo's hand in her right hand. She took Maya's in her left. Little Sarah clung to her skirt, her small fist clutching the fabric. Eleanor took one last look around the small cottage. The unmade beds, the cooling hearth, the wooden bird on the floor. It was the only home her children had ever known, a place of love and laughter, and now unbearable grief. She whispered a silent goodbye to the life she had lived within these walls. Then she turned and opened the door. The gray light of the day flooded in, stark and unforgiving. Holding her children's hands, their warmth a fragile anchor against the cold terror flooding her veins, Eleanor Vance stepped outside. She pulled the door shut behind her, the click of the latch sounding like a cell door locking. Leading her children by the hand, Eleanor walked towards the town square, each step feeling like a march to her own execution. The first thing that struck Eleanor was the sound. It was a low humming thing, the sound of 100 quiet conversations blending into a single menacing drone. As they stepped from the quiet side street into the edge of Blackwood Town Square, that hum rose to meet them, a wave of noise and heat and dust. It washed over her, and for a moment, her legs threatened to give out. She tightened her grip on Leo's small hand and pulled Maya a little closer. Little Sarah, nestled in her other arm, hid her face against Eleanor's shoulder, sensing the change in the air. The square was not just full, it was teeming. People stood in tight clusters around the central auction platform, their Sunday clothes looking strangely formal for a Tuesday. Farmers in clean overalls, merchants with their arms crossed, wives clutching baskets they had no intention of filling. Their faces turned as one when the Vance family appeared. The humming of conversation did not stop. Instead, it changed pitch, dipping into hushed whispers that followed them like a shadow. Eleanor could feel their eyes on her worn dress, on the careful braids in Maya's hair, on Leo's determined little chin held high just like his father's. She saw faces she knew. Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife, stood near the courthouse steps, her own face pale with a pity that felt almost as sharp as scorn. Mr. Abernathy, who ran the smithy, met her gaze for a fraction of a second before finding something intensely interesting about the dirt on his boots. They were not cruel people, not most of them, but their sorrow was a passive, useless thing. It could not stop the gavel. It could not pay a debt. It only served to make her family's shame a more public spectacle. Then there were the other faces, the curious ones leaning forward with hungry eyes, eager for a drama that was not their own. They were here for the show, and at the very front, standing with his thick arms crossed over his chest, was Silas Croft. He was not looking at her. He was surveying the crowd, a faint proprietary smile on his lips, as if he owned not just the platform but every person gathered there. He was the master of this grim theater, and she was the unwilling star of his production. The sight of him sent a spike of cold fury through her, a feeling so sharp it momentarily burned away the fear. It was the anger of a cornered animal, useless but pure. A bailiff, a grim man with a face like weathered stone, detached himself from the side of the platform and approached them. He did not speak to her directly. He simply gestured with his chin toward a single, isolated bench placed unnervingly close to the auction block. It was set apart from the other sparse seating, an island of disgrace. "Wait here," he grunted, the words clipped and devoid of any emotion. Eleanor nodded, unable to form a word. She led her children to the bench. It felt 1,000 miles away. Each step was a performance. She kept her back straight, her head up, refusing to let them see her crumble. She was a mother leading her children through a bad dream, and her only duty was to pretend it was not real until the very last moment. She sat down on the hard wood, settling Sarah on her lap and pulling Leo and Maya close, one on each side. She tried to create a fortress of her arms, a tiny, fragile kingdom against the staring world. "Mama, I'm thirsty," Maya whispered, her little voice cutting through the thick air. "I know, sweetling. Soon," Eleanor whispered back, her own throat as dry as dust. "Let's play a quiet game. Let's count all the birds we can see in the sky." Leo looked up, his brow furrowed with a worry too old for his 8 years. "There are no birds, Mama. They're all scared away by the noise." His simple, devastating truth almost broke her. She swallowed hard and squeezed his shoulder. "Then we'll just have to imagine them, won't we? Imagine a big blue one, just for you." She began to hum, a low, shaky tune that Thomas used to sing to them at bedtime. It was a song about a ship sailing home, a melody of safety and return. But her voice kept catching, and the tune felt like a lie in this place. The sun beat down, hot and unforgiving. Dust kicked up by shuffling feet coated her skin, settling in the creases of her dress. The smell of nervous sweat, of horses, and cheap ale from the tavern nearby filled her nostrils. Time began to stretch and warp. A minute felt like an hour. An hour felt like an eternity. She clutched the small, tarnished silver locket hidden in the palm of her hand. The cool metal was a tiny point of focus. Inside was Thomas's face, smiling. Inside was a lock of Leo's baby hair. It was all she had left of the world that was, and the world she was about to lose. A sharp crack echoed across the square, and a new voice, loud and booming, silenced the crowd. "All right, folks, let's get started." An auctioneer, a portly man with a florid face and a booming voice, stood upon the platform. He held a wooden gavel in his hand, and he moved with a practiced, efficient air. He was a merchant of misfortune, and business was about to begin. "We start today with Lot 1, he announced, gesturing to a sturdy-looking plow being wheeled forward. "The property of the late Jedediah Smith, a fine piece of equipment, barely used. Who'll start the bidding at $20? Hands went up. Voices called out numbers. The auctioneer's chant began, a rhythmic, hypnotic cadence of rising prices and feigned excitement. "20, I have 20. Do I hear 25? 25 from the man in the green hat. Do I hear 30? 30, a fine price for a fine plow." Eleanor watched, but she did not see. The plow, the bids, the faces in the crowd all blurred into a meaningless watercolor of dread. With every crack of the gavel, a piece of someone else's life was sold away. A set of harnesses, a dozen chickens clucking nervously in a cage. Each item represented a failure, a farm lost, a family uprooted. And with each sale, the auctioneer was simply clearing his throat for the main event. He was warming up his voice to sell her children. Her mind drifted. She remembered Thomas, coming home from the fields, his face streaked with dirt, but his eyes bright. He would lift Sarah into the air until she shrieked with laughter. He would listen to Leo's stories about imaginary dragons with grave seriousness. He would take Eleanor's hand in the quiet of the evening, his calloused palm a geography of hard work and love. How could that man, that good kind man, have brought them to this? The secret of his debt was a ghost that now sat beside her on the bench, heavier than any person. Had he been so ashamed, so afraid to tell her? The question circled in her head, offering no comfort, only a fresh wave of grief for the man she thought she knew completely. "Sold to Mr. Croft for $42, the auctioneer boomed, pointing his gavel in Silas's direction. Silas had bought a pair of fine workhorses. He hadn't needed them. He had his own, better stock. It was a purchase of pure dominance, a way of showing everyone that he could, and so he would. He caught Eleanor's eye as the horses were led away, and he gave a slow, deliberate nod, the corners of his mouth twitching upwards. It was a gesture of ownership, a silent message that said, "This is just the beginning. Soon they will belong to me too." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She felt a wave of nausea and squeezed her eyes shut, forcing it down. She had to be strong. She had to stay present for all of them. She opened her eyes and focused on Maya, who was now tracing patterns in the dust on the bench with her finger. Little Sarah had finally fallen into a fitful sleep on her lap, her small chest rising and falling in a rhythm that was painfully, beautifully alive. Leo sat stiffly beside her, his gaze fixed on the platform, his small hands clenched into fists in his lap. He understood. He did not know the details, but he understood the shape and the smell of danger. An hour passed, then another. The sun climbed higher, directly overhead, bleaching the color from the sky. The initial shock of the crowd had worn off, replaced by a weary, expectant patience. They were waiting. The farm equipment was dwindling. A wagon with a broken wheel, a pile of lumber, a stack of hay bales, each sold for a pittance. The lives of her neighbors dismantled and scattered for pocket change. She could feel the end approaching. The air grew thick and heavy. The bailiff shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Silas Croft uncrossed his arms and leaned forward slightly, his body thrumming with anticipation. The final item, a set of rusty blacksmith's tools, was sold. A profound silence fell over the town square. It was different from the earlier quiet. This was a held breath, a stillness born of dread and morbid curiosity. The auctioneer wiped his brow with a large handkerchief. He took a long, slow sip of water from a glass on his lectern. The sound of him swallowing was unnaturally loud in the silence. He set the glass down with a soft click. He shuffled the papers in front of him, making a show of organizing them. The delay was a form of torture. It stretched Eleanor's nerves until she thought they would snap. She could hear the blood pounding in her ears. She could feel Sarah's warm weight on her lap, a precious, unbearable anchor to the moment. The auctioneer looked up. His eyes, small and businesslike, swept over the crowd and landed, for the first time, directly on Eleanor and her children. He did not look at them as people. He looked at them as the final lot of the day. He cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound that scraped across her raw nerves. The entire world seemed to shrink to the space between her and that wooden platform. Time stopped. His voice, when it came, was steady and clear, carrying to every corner of the silent square. And now, he announced, his tone flat and procedural, to settle the debt of the late Thomas Vance. The auctioneer's voice fell into a void. For a single, suspended heartbeat, the town square held its breath. The name of the late Thomas Vance hung in the air, a ghost summoned into the harsh midday sun. Eleanor felt the sound rather than heard it, a low vibration that traveled from the dusty ground up through the soles of her worn shoes and settled like a stone in her stomach. Her world, which had been a chaotic swirl of noise and dread, suddenly snapped into a terrifying, silent focus. There was only the wooden platform, the pale sky above it, and the pronouncement of her family's ruin. From the corner of her eye, she saw the town bailiff shift his weight. He was a man named Miller, a man who had known Thomas since they were boys. He had even come to their small cottage once to share a meal after a barn raising. Now, his face was a mask of professional duty, his eyes fixed on a point just over her head. He pushed himself off the courthouse wall and began to walk toward their bench. Each step was heavy, deliberate, the crunch of his boots on the dry earth marking a countdown to the unthinkable. Leo, her eldest, saw him coming and instinctively moved closer to her, his small hand finding the fabric of her skirt. Maya watched the bailiff with wooden, unblinking eyes, her brow furrowed in confusion. The bailiff stopped before them. He did not look at Eleanor. He could not. Instead, he addressed the children in a low, almost gentle tone that was somehow worse than a command. "All right, children, it's time, just for a moment." Leo squared his narrow shoulders. "We're not going anywhere without our mother." His voice was a boy's, but the resolve in it was his father's. A terrible, useless pride swelled in Eleanor's chest. He was trying to protect them. Her brave, foolish boy. The bailiff's gaze flickered to Eleanor, a flash of pity in his eyes before it was extinguished. "Eleanor, please, don't make this harder than it has to be." Harder, the word was a joke. A cruel, bitter laugh tried to escape her throat, but it died as a strangled gasp. What did he know of hard? Why he died? Did he know the hardness of a world that would sell children to settle a man's debt? Did he know the hardness of a mother's heart as it was being ripped from her chest? She wanted to scream these things at him. She wanted to stand up, to plant her feet and become an immovable wall between this man and her babies. But her body was a traitor. When she tried to push herself up from the bench, her legs trembled and refused to hold her. They felt like water, like they had forgotten the simple mechanics of standing. A cold sweat broke out across her forehead. All she could do was sit there, frozen, her hands clenched into white-knuckled fists in her lap. Her gaze locked on the bailiff, a silent, desperate plea. "Don't do this. Please don't." He sighed, a sound of weary resignation, and knelt down. He spoke to Maya and little Sarah. "Come on now, it's just up a few steps. Your mother will be right here watching." He offered his hands. Maya shrank back, pressing herself against Leo. Little Sarah, who trusted everyone, looked from the man's outstretched hands to her mother's frozen face. The confusion in her eyes was a physical blow. She did not understand, and that innocence, that pure, childish ignorance of the horror unfolding, was the most painful thing of all. Leo took a deep breath. "It's all right," he whispered to his sisters, his voice shaking slightly. "We'll go, but we're staying together." He took Maya's hand in one of his, and with the other, he gently coaxed Sarah forward. He would not let the bailiff touch them. He led his sisters toward the platform steps, a small, solemn procession of the condemned. Eleanor watched them go, every inch of the 10 yards separating them feeling like a mile. She could smell the dust kicked up by their small feet. She could see the way the sun caught the auburn highlights in Maya's hair, the same color as her own. She saw the small patch on the elbow of Leo's jacket that she had sewn just last month, humming a tune as she worked. These were the details that were killing her. Not the crowd, not the auctioneer, but the tiny, intimate pieces of her children's lives being paraded toward a block of wood. The sound of their shoes on the steps was hollow and loud in the unnatural quiet. One step, two, three. With each one, a part of Eleanor's soul seemed to tear away. They reached the top and stood there, blinking in the bright sunlight, three small figures lost on the white, empty stage. They looked so fragile, so terribly out of place. They looked like birds with broken wings. The bailiff gestured for them to stand in the center. Then he retreated to the side, his job done. The children huddled together, a tiny island of fear in a sea of watching eyes. Leo stood slightly in front of the girls, his small body a shield. Maya held tight to his shirt, her face buried in his back. Sarah clutched Maya's dress, her thumb finding its way into her mouth as she stared out at the blur of faces. Her eyes searched, found Eleanor, and locked on. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Some people looked away, their faces etched with shame. Others stared, their curiosity a morbid, vulture-like thing. Eleanor felt their eyes on her children, but they were distant, unreal. The only reality was the sight of her children standing on that platform, displayed like furniture, like livestock. A wave of nausea washed over her. She pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting back the bile that rose in her throat. Her other hand fumbled for the locket at her neck. Her fingers closed around the cool, worn silver. She squeezed it so tightly the edges dug into her palm, a small, sharp pain that anchored her to the moment. "Thomas. Oh, Thomas, forgive me. I couldn't protect them." Then, a movement near the platform drew her eye. Silas Croft detached himself from the group of landowners he'd been standing with. He walked with a slow, proprietary swagger, his boots thudding against the packed earth. He did not go up the steps. Instead, he circled the base of the platform, his head tilted back as he looked up at the children. His small, calculating eyes moved over them, from Leo's defiant posture to Maya's trembling frame, to Sarah's frightened face. There was no pity in his gaze. There was no humanity. There was only the cold, hard assessment of an asset. He stopped directly in front of them, resting one hand on the edge of the platform. He looked at Leo. "A strong back on that one," he said, his voice a low rumble meant only for the auctioneer, but loud enough for Eleanor to hear clearly. "Good for field work in a few years." He then gestured with his chin toward Maya. "The girl looks quick with her hands. She'll do for the kitchens. Mending, cleaning." He was appraising them. He was discussing her children's futures as if they were nothing more than a pair of oxen or a plot of land. Every word was a hammer blow against Eleanor's heart. A fire, hot and pure, erupted in her chest, burning through the ice of her paralysis. A growl rose in her throat. She would not let this happen. She would not let him speak of them this way. She tried to stand again, and this time a surge of pure maternal fury gave her strength. Her legs wobbled, but they held. She pushed herself up from the bench, her body shaking with a violent tremor. She took one step forward, then another. She was going to walk to that platform. She was going to take her children's hands, and she was going to walk away from this whole nightmare. And to hell with the debt. To hell with Silas Croft. To hell with all of them. But Croft saw her. His eyes met hers across the square, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his florid face. It was a smile of absolute victory. It said, "Look at you, you are powerless. These children are mine." That smile stopped her cold. It was a wall of invisible force, and she slammed into it with all the momentum of her desperate hope. The strength drained out of her as quickly as it had come. Her knees buckled, and she would have fallen to the dust if the man standing behind her hadn't reached out and steadied her by the elbow. She barely registered his touch. Her gaze was still locked on Croft. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to the auctioneer, a signal to proceed. He had finished his inspection. He was satisfied with his purchase before it had even been made. He owned them already in his mind, and this was all just a formality, a show for his own gratification. He stepped back, folding his thick arms across his chest, the smug lord of the manor surveying his domain. The auctioneer cleared his throat again, ready to begin the bidding. The crowd fell silent once more. The air grew thick, heavy with anticipation. Eleanor stood swaying, held up by a stranger's hand, her eyes fixed on her children. She felt a million miles away from her own body. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. This was a fever dream, a story told to frightened children in the dark. In a moment, she would wake up in her own bed, the scent of lavender from her garden drifting through the window, and Thomas would be beside her, his arm draped over her waist. Her children would be sleeping safely in their rooms down the hall. But she did not wake up. The sun was still hot on her face. The dust still coated her tongue, and her children were still standing on that wooden platform, waiting to be sold. It was too much for little Sarah. The silence, the staring faces, the terrifying height of the platform, and her mother so close and yet so impossibly far away. Her small face, which had been a mask of confused fear, began to crumble. Her lower lip trembled. A tear spilled over and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. Her chest hitched with a show. And then, her small voice, thin and piercing, cut through the suffocating silence of the square. It was not a scream. It was a simple, desperate plea. "Mama!" The word was a key, unlocking all the pain Eleanor had been holding back. It shot across the square and struck her with the force of a physical blow. A raw, guttural sob was torn from her throat. Her heart did not just break. It felt as if it had exploded, shattering into a million pieces of incandescent agony that seared every part of her being. The sound of her daughter's voice calling for her while she stood helpless and watched her be sold was a torment beyond any she had ever imagined. It was the sound of her failure as a mother, the sound of her world ending. That single word, "Mama," was not a shout. It was a thin, trembling thread of sound that unraveled the entire world. It cut through the low murmur of the crowd, through the crisp autumn air, and went straight into Eleanor's chest. For a moment, everything stopped. The gossiping townsfolk fell silent. The bailiff on the platform froze, his hand hovering near Leo's shoulder. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Sarah's cry was the sound of a small animal caught in a trap, a sound of pure, uncomprehending terror. It was the only real thing in a square full of ghosts. Eleanor's body, which had been a statue of ice, tried to move. Her muscles screamed in protest, locked in a paralysis of horror. She wanted to run, to storm the platform and snatch her children back, to claw at the faces of anyone who tried to stop her. But her feet were nailed to the dusty ground. Her throat was full of sand and broken glass. All she could do was watch as little Sarah's face crumpled, her tiny hands reaching out, her gaze fixed on her mother as if Eleanor were the only lighthouse in a world-swallowing storm. Leo, ever the protector, put a shaky arm around his sister, his own face a mask of pale, stoic fear. Maya simply stared, her eyes wizened and dark, absorbing a horror too vast for her 6 years. The auctioneer, a man named Miller whose face was as weathered as old leather, cleared his throat. The momentary spell was broken. He was not a cruel man by nature, Eleanor knew. He was simply a man who did his job, whether that job was selling a prize hog or dismantling a family. He picked up a sheet of paper from his lectern, the formal gesture a grotesque mockery of order and civility. His voice, when it came, was practiced and devoid of emotion, a tool of his trade. As per the legal contract held by Mr. Silas Croft, he began, his voice rolling over the silent crowd, we are here to resolve the outstanding debt of the late Thomas Vance. He paused, letting the name hang in the air like a funeral shroud. Eleanor flinched, the mention of her husband's name in this context a fresh wound. This was Thomas's legacy now. Not his warm smile, not the sturdy shelves he built, not the way he taught Leo how to skip stones. This public shame was his final monument. The auctioneer continued, reading from the paper. The debt stands at $500. As no liquid assets were found, the contract specifies remedy through indenture. A low, uneasy murmur rippled through the onlookers. The word indenture was an old one, a relic from a harsher time that most preferred to forget. To hear it spoken aloud in the middle of their town on a bright Tuesday afternoon was unsettling. It made the familiar ground beneath their feet feel treacherous. Miller's gaze flickered toward the three small figures on the platform. The terms stipulate a period of service, he said, his voice dropping slightly. For the persons of Leo Vance, age 9, Maya Vance, age 6, and Sarah Vance, age 4. He did not look at Eleanor. No one did. It was easier to watch the spectacle if you pretended the mother was not there, her heart being methodically torn from her chest. This indenture shall last for a term of 10 years, the auctioneer declared, or until such time as the debt is considered repaid by their labor. The children are to be housed, fed, and clothed by the holder of the contract. He folded the paper carefully, the crisp sound like a bone snapping. We will now open the bidding for the indenture of the Vance children. The opening bid must meet the debt, $100. Do I have an opening bid of $500? An absolute, profound silence descended upon the square. It was heavier than stone. It was the sound of 100 people choosing not to see, not to speak, not to act. Eleanor's gaze swept across the faces. She saw Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife, who had given Leo a sweet roll just last week. Mrs. Gable was now intently studying her own shoes. She saw Mr. Abernathy, the blacksmith, a man Thomas had shared many an ale with. He stared grimly at the courthouse steps, his jaw tight. They were all there, neighbors, friends, the fabric of the community she had believed in, and they were all letting this happen. Their silence was a verdict. It was an agreement. Eleanor's hand, which had been lying limp in her palm, tightened around the silver locket she wore. The cool metal was a small, solid point in a dissolving reality. Inside were the faces of her love and her hope. Thomas on one side, a lock of Leo's baby hair on the other. It was all she had left of her life before this moment. She squeezed it until the edges dug painfully into her palm, the small hurt a distant echo of the immense agony in her soul. She prayed to a God she was no longer sure she believed in. Please, someone, anyone. The auctioneer waited. He scanned the crowd, his eyes lingering for a second longer than necessary on the wealthiest farmers. $500 to open, he repeated, his voice a little louder now, a little more impatient. The silence stretched, becoming unbearable. It was a vacuum pulling all the air from Eleanor's lungs. Then a movement. Silas Croft, who had been standing near the side of the platform with his arms crossed, took a deliberate step forward. He moved with the unhurried confidence of a man who owned the world, or at least this small, miserable corner of it. A path cleared for him as if by an invisible force. He walked to the foot of the steps and stopped, placing one polished boot on the bottom plank. He did not look at the auctioneer. He looked at the children. His gaze was like that of a farmer inspecting livestock. He looked at Leo's sturdy frame, at Maya's nimble fingers, at Sarah's tear-streaked face. There was no pity in his eyes. There was only calculation. Ownership, a sickening possessive pride. He was savoring this. Every second of Eleanor's public destruction was a feast for his bitter giver soul. He let his gaze drift from the children and find Eleanor in the crowd. He held her eyes, and a slow, cruel smirk spread across his florid face. It was a look that said, "This is my power. You are nothing." He turned his head slightly toward the auctioneer, never taking his eyes off Eleanor. His voice was a low, gravelly boom that carried easily across the silent square. $500, he said. It was not a bid. It was a declaration of victory. The exact amount of the debt, not a penny more. It was the ultimate insult. He was not buying children. He was simply collecting his due. He was saying they were worth precisely the number on a piece of paper and nothing more. A collective shudder went through the crowd. It was done. Everyone knew it was done. The auctioneer, Miller, nodded curtly. "I have a bid of $500 from Mr. Silas Croft." His professional mask was firmly in place. "Do I hear 510? Do I hear any other bid?" he asked, but it was a formality. He scanned the faces one last time. Who would dare? Who would dare cross Silas Croft, the man who held half the town's mortgages in his ledger? Who had the money or the foolish courage to challenge him for 3 destitute children? The silence that answered was deeper and more final than before. It was the silence of resignation, the silence of a grave being filled. Eleanor felt a strange calm settle over her. The frantic terror subsided, replaced by a vast, cold emptiness. It was the calm of the condemned, the peace that comes when all hope has been bled away. She could no longer feel the splintery bench beneath her. She could no longer smell the dust and the sweat in the air. Her world had shrunk to the 3 small figures standing on that cursed platform of wood, their futures about to be extinguished by the swing of a hammer. She saw Leo straighten his shoulders, trying to be brave for his sisters. He met her gaze across the distance, and in his young eyes she saw a reflection of her own broken heart. He was trying to tell her it was all right, that he would take care of them. A fresh wave of nausea rolled through her. He was 9 years old. He should be climbing trees and scraping his knees, not preparing for a decade of servitude. The auctioneer raised his wooden gavel. The small mallet looked impossibly heavy, impossibly dark against the pale sky. $500 from Mr. Croft, he called out, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of finality. Are there no other bids? Silence. Cold, dead, damning silence. Eleanor closed her eyes. She could not watch. She could not bear to see the gavel fall. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she saw Thomas's face. Not the gaunt, worried man he had become at the end, but the young man she had married. The one who promised to always protect her, to build a life with her. "I'm sorry, Thomas," she whispered into the void of her own mind. "I'm so sorry. I failed them." A single tear escaped her tightly shut lids, tracing a slow, hot path through the layer of dust on her cheek. "Going once," the auctioneer's voice boomed, and the sound struck her like a physical blow. Her eyes snapped open. She had to watch. She owed them that. She owed her children a witness to their ruin. She would not hide. She would force herself to see the very last moment. Silas Croft was still smirking, his victory complete. He had already turned as if to speak to the bailiff, already making arrangements for his new property. He was a man taking possession. The children were huddled together, a tiny island of terror in a sea of indifference. Maya had buried her face in Leo's side. Sarah's cries had subsided into heartbreaking, hiccuping sobs. The auctioneer's arm was a machine, his movements practiced and sure. The gavel remained high for a moment, catching the noon sun. It was the apex of the arc, the pinnacle of Eleanor's nightmare. The entire town seemed to be frozen in this single, terrible tableau. The smirking victor, the broken mother, the silent cowards, and the terrified children. The auctioneer's voice rang out again, louder this time, an iron bell tolling the end of a world. He leaned forward, his eyes on the wooden block where the gavel would strike. Going twice. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Going twice, each syllable was a hammer blow against Eleanor's soul, cracking the last fragile pieces of her composure. The world around her dissolved into a hazy, indistinct blur of dusty light and shadowy figures. All she could see, with any clarity, was the auctioneer's arm, frozen for a moment at the peak of its arc. The wooden gavel held high like a judge's sentence. All she could hear was the blood pounding in her ears, a frantic drumbeat counting down the final seconds of her family's life as she knew it. Her own breath caught in her bone, a dry, ragged thing. She could feel the stares of the crowd, a thousand tiny needles pricking her skin. There was pity in some eyes, a morbid curiosity in others, and cold indifference in most. They were watching a spectacle, a small-town drama to be recounted over dinner. For her, it was the end of everything. Her body was a statue of ice, locked onto the bench, but her mind was screaming. It was a silent, unending shriek that no one else could hear. She willed her legs to move, to stand, to run to that platform and snatch her children away. But they were leaden, disconnected from her will. Slowly, deliberately, Eleanor closed her eyes. She could no longer bear the sight of it. She could not watch the final, definitive strike that would sever her from her children. She could not watch Leo's small shoulders squared in a brave but futile attempt to protect his sisters. She could not watch Maya's bewildered face, her eyes searching the crowd for an explanation that would never come. And she would not watch Sarah's tear-streaked face as her world was sold for a handful of silver. In the darkness behind her eyelids, the square vanished. The noise faded. There was only one image, burned into her memory, an image she clutched in her mind just as her fingers clutched the locket in her palm. It was Thomas, not the tired, worried man of his final months, but the Thomas from a sunnier, simpler time. His smile was easy, his eyes full of a gentle light as he looked at her. He was standing by the creek behind their cottage, sunlight dappling through the leaves of the old oak tree. He had just finished mending the small wooden fence, and he wiped a smear of dirt from his brow with the back of his hand. "It's a good home, Ellie," he had said, his voice warm and sure. "Not much, but it's ours, and I'll always keep you safe here. All of you." A single tear escaped her tightly shut eye. It felt hot against her cold skin, tracing a slow, clean path through the layer of dust on her cheek. An apology formed in the silence of her heart, a whisper meant only for him. "I'm sorry, Thomas. I am so sorry. You built us a world, and I let it be torn down. You promised to keep us safe, and I have failed to do the same. I was not strong enough. Forgive me." Her mind replayed 1,000 forgotten moments. The feel of his hand in hers as they walked home from the market. The sound of his laughter as he tossed a squealing Leo into the air. The quiet pride in his eyes as he watched Maya carefully planting flower seeds beside the door. The way he would hum a soft tune while rocking baby Sarah to sleep. These were the bricks and mortar of their life. The very thing Silas Croft was now grinding into dust. Each memory was a fresh torment, a reminder of everything she was losing. She thought of her children on that platform. Leo would be biting his lip, trying so hard not to show his fear. He was his father's son, always trying to be the man of the house, even now. He would be holding Maya's hand, his small grip a promise of protection he couldn't possibly keep. And Maya, sweet, sensitive Maya, would be utterly lost. She would be looking at the faces in the crowd, her brow furrowed, trying to understand the terrible game the adults were playing. Her confusion would be a pain sharper than any physical blow. Then there was Sarah, her baby. Her cries of "Mama" were still echoing in Eleanor's chest, a wound that would never heal. In her mind, she could feel the phantom weight of Sarah in her arms, the soft down of her hair against her cheek. To have that taken away, to know another woman would be putting her to bed at night, another woman would be wiping her tears. The thought was an agony so profound it stole her breath. This was not a debt being settled. This was a theft of heartbeats, of bedtime stories, of scraped knees and future smiles. The silence in the square stretched, becoming thin and taut, ready to snap. It was a silence filled with unspoken things, the shame of the townsfolk who did nothing, the triumphant gloating of Silas Croft, the cold procedural finality of the law. Eleanor could feel it all, even with her eyes closed. It pressed down on her, a physical weight that threatened to crush her. She was a ship going down in a silent ocean, and no one was even throwing her a rope. She felt a strange calm begin to settle over the panic. It was the calm of utter surrender, the calm of the frost that settles on a field after the harvest is done. There was nothing left to fight for. The battle was over. She had lost. All that remained was the hollow echo of what had been. She focused on the cold, smooth shape of the locket in her hand. Inside was the tiny portrait of Thomas and a lock of Leo's baby hair. It was the alpha and omega of her life as a wife and mother, all contained in a small silver circle. The auctioneer's voice, when it came again, seemed to travel from a great distance. It was low, resonant, and devoid of any emotion. It was the sound of fate itself. Sold, then, for the price of the debt, to Mr. Silas Croft. He did not finish the sentence, but she heard it. She heard the finality in his tone. The gavel was beginning its descent. She could feel the movement in the air, the slight shift as the heavy wooden hammer began to fall. Time seemed to slow, to stretch like molasses. Each fraction of a second was an eternity of pain. The arc of the gavel was a dark rainbow, and at its end was not a pot of gold, but a chasm of despair. She pictured the wood of the gavel meeting the wood of the block, the sharp cracking sound that would echo through the square, the sound that would mark the end of the Vance family, the sound that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her miserable life. She braced herself for it, her entire body tensing for the impact. This was it, the point of no return. A breath, a heartbeat, the world held still. The sharp crack never came. Instead, a voice cut through the thick, expectant air. It was not loud, but it was filled with such power, such absolute authority, that it seemed to shake the very dust in the square. It was a man's voice, clear and steady, and it sliced through the tension like a knife. Stop! The word was not a shout. It was a command, as solid and unmovable as the stone courthouse at the edge of the square. Stop! It sliced through the humid, stagnant air, and for a heart-stopping second, everything did. The auctioneer's arm, which had been descending in its final terrible arc, froze in place. The heavy wooden gavel hovered inches above the block. A bird of prey halted mid-strike. The murmuring of the crowd ceased, replaced by a silence so profound Eleanor could hear the frantic beat of her own blood in her ears. She had closed her eyes to await the end, to retreat into the darkness where Thomas's memory lived. But that single word pulled them open. Through the blur of her unshed tears, the scene was surreal, a painting that had suddenly cracked. The auctioneer stood with his mouth slightly agape, a comical figure of interrupted authority. The bailiff, who had been watching with grim satisfaction, now looked confused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. On the platform, little Leo had stopped trying to be brave, his face a mask of bewilderment. Maya was looking not at Eleanor, but towards the back of the crowd, her small hand still clutching Sarah's dress. And Sarah, her cries momentarily silenced by the sudden shift in tone, hiccuped softly, her wide, tear-filled eyes searching for the source of the interruption. Eleanor's body remained rigid on the bench. She felt as though if she moved, the spell would break and the gavel would fall. Then the crowd began to stir. It was not a sound at first, but a motion, a collective turning of heads. A path began to form, people shuffling backward, stepping aside as if for a procession. Out of the dense pack of onlookers at the very rear of the square, a figure emerged. He was tall, and that was the first thing anyone noticed. Taller than most men in Blackwood, with a lean build that spoke of travel and purpose, not farm labor. He wore a dark traveler's coat, the fabric clean and well-made, a stark contrast to the faded cotton and worn leather of the townspeople. It hung on his frame with an easy grace that felt entirely out of place in this dusty, desperate arena. As he walked forward, his boots made a steady, measured sound on the hard-packed earth. Each step was deliberate. He was not hurrying, yet he moved with an undeniable momentum that drew every eye. Sunlight caught the streaks of silver at his temples, a distinguished touch to his dark hair. But it was his face that held them all captive. It was a face carved with sharp intelligence, his eyes a piercing shade of gray that seemed to take in everything at once without lingering on any single detail. He carried an air of quiet sorrow, but it was overshadowed by an unyielding resolve. He did not look at the pitying faces in the crowd. He did not look at Silas Croft, who was now squinting, trying to place him. He did not even look at Eleanor or the children on the block. His gaze was fixed, like a hawk's, on the auctioneer. Eleanor watched him, her breath caught in her throat. Who was he? Her mind, numbed by grief and terror, could not form a logical thought. For a wild, fleeting moment, she wondered if he was an angel, a spirit sent by Thomas from whatever peaceful shore he had reached, a protector summoned by the sheer force of a mother's despair. The idea was madness, a fantasy born of a broken heart, yet in that instant, it felt more real than the splintery bench beneath her or the cruel sun on her neck. She had prayed for a miracle, whispered pleas into her pillow at night until her voice was raw. But she had never truly believed one would come. Miracles did not happen in Blackwood. Debts were collected, families were broken, and the powerful always won. The stranger reached the foot of the auction platform. He stopped, his presence creating a pocket of silence that pushed back against the rising tide of whispers. The auctioneer finally found his voice, though it was thin and reedy, stripped of its earlier boom. "This is an official proceeding," he stammered, gesturing vaguely with the gavel. "You cannot interrupt." Before he could finish, another voice cut in, low and gravelly with rising fury. "What is the meaning of this?" Silas Croft had moved to the edge of the platform, his large body blocking the view of the children. His florid face was darkening with anger. "Who in blazes are you to halt this auction?" He glared down at the stranger, his stance a clear challenge, the posture of a man whose territory had been invaded. He was the king of this small, miserable kingdom, and he did not tolerate defiance. The stranger did not even turn his head. He continued to look at the auctioneer, his expression unreadable. His calm, a stark and infuriating contrast to Silas's growing rage. The complete dismissal was more insulting than any retort. It was as if Silas Croft, the man who held the town in his fist, was nothing more than a buzzing fly, an irrelevant noise in the background. The crowd felt it. A few people shifted uncomfortably. They had never seen anyone treat Silas with such open disregard. Then the stranger spoke again, and his voice, though still calm, carried to every corner of the square. It was clear and unwavering, a stone dropping into a still pond. "I said stop." He let the words hang in the air for a beat, a quiet echo of his first command. He then lifted his chin slightly, and his gray eyes held the auctioneer's, pinning him in place. "I will pay the debt." A wave of shock rippled through the crowd, a collective, audible gasp. People turned to their neighbors, their faces a mixture of disbelief and frantic curiosity. Pay the debt? The Vance debt was the stuff of cautionary tales, a sum so large it was almost mythical. It was an amount that no one in this town could produce on a whim, if at all. It was the reason this entire horrifying spectacle was taking place. The law was the law because the money was impossible. Eleanor felt the words like a physical blow, not of pain, but of pure, unadulterated shock. Her heart, which had been hammering with terror, seemed to stop altogether. Did he say, pay the debt? The silver locket she had been clutching felt slick with sweat in her palm. The image of Thomas inside seemed to swim before her eyes. Was this real? Was she truly awake? It had to be a trick, a crueler game than even Silas could devise, to offer hope at the last possible second, only to snatch it away. Her mind recoiled from the possibility. It was safer to remain in the abyss of despair than to climb halfway to the light, only to be thrown back down. On the platform, Silas Croft let out a short, barking laugh. It was a harsh, ugly sound. "Pay the debt?" he scoffed, his voice dripping with condescension. "Do you have any idea the amount we are talking about, stranger? This is not a few shillings for a stray goat. This is a lifetime of labor." He gestured dismissively towards the man below, trying to reclaim his authority, to paint the stranger as a fool. The stranger's gaze finally moved from the auctioneer. It shifted slowly, deliberately, until it rested on Silas. The two men locked eyes, and the air between them crackled with a sudden, intense animosity that seemed far older than this single moment. It was a stare that held history, a silent conversation the rest of the square could only witness. The stranger's calm did not break, but his eyes hardened, the gray turning to flint. "I know the amount," he said, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more personal, more pointed. "Down to the last penny." He paused, letting the implication of his words sink in. Then he delivered the final impossible blow. "And I will pay it in full." In full, the two words were a death knell for Silas Croft's victory. They were a declaration of power that dwarfed his own. He did not offer to negotiate. He did not ask for terms. He simply stated a fact. The crowd fell utterly silent again, waiting. This was no longer just about the Vance family. This was a battle of wills, a clash between the known tyrant and this unknown force. Eleanor's entire body began to tremble. A single tear, the what she had held back, finally escaped and traced a hot path down her cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of terrifying, fragile, unbearable hope. The hope she had been too afraid to feel. It flooded her senses, so powerful it was painful. She could feel the rough fabric of her dress against her skin, smell the dust and the faint scent of rain in the air. She saw the concerned face of her son, Leo, who was now staring directly at her, his expression asking a question she could not answer. She was coming back to life, and the sensation was overwhelming. The stranger's coat shifted as he reached inside. The movement was slow, deliberate, drawing every eye. He was not reaching for a weapon. He was doing something far more dramatic. But it was Silas's face that told the real story. His smug, triumphant expression had vanished completely. The condescending smirk was gone, wiped away as if it had never been there. His face, which had been red with blustering anger, began to contort. The color deepened to a dark, mottled purple. His jaw clenched so tightly that a muscle jumped along his cheek. His small eyes, usually glinting with greed, were now wide with a mixture of disbelief and pure, unadulterated rage. He stared at the stranger, this man who had appeared from nowhere, who had spoken a few simple sentences and undone everything. He looked at him not just as a man who had interfered, but as an enemy who had deliberately, personally, and publicly ruined him. The victory he had craved, the public humiliation of Thomas Vance's legacy, had been stolen from his grasp at the very last second, and in its place was his own. The crowd gasped, a low, collective sound of awe and fear, and Silas Croft's face twisted into a mask of pure hatred as he stared at the stranger who had just destroyed his world. The rage on Silas Croft's face was a storm breaking. His complexion, usually ruddy from sun and drink, deepened to a shade of violet plum. Veins stood out on his thick neck, a roadmap of pure fury. For a moment, he seemed to choke on his own anger, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from the water. The crowd, which had been a collection of murmurs and shuffles, went utterly still. The silence was absolute, a heavy blanket pressed down upon the square. It was as if the entire town held its breath, waiting for the explosion. "Who in blazes do you think you are?" Silas finally roared, his voice cracking with disbelief. He took a half-step forward, his big hands clenched into fists at his sides. His small, calculating eyes, which had moments before gleamed with triumph, were now narrowed slits of incandescent hatred. He was speaking to the stranger, but his body was angled toward the bailiff and the auctioneer, as if to remind them who held the real power in this town, or who he thought held the power. "This is a legal proceeding. You can't just walk in here and—" His words trailed off, useless and sputtering, because the stranger paid him no mind at all. It was the most profound dismissal Eleanor had ever witnessed. He did not even grant Silas a glance. Instead, Julian Croft moved with an unhurried grace that was a stark contrast to the scene's raw tension. He walked past the edge of the platform, his boots making soft sounds in the thick dust. His path was direct, aimed not at his fuming brother, but at the bailiff who stood frozen by the auctioneer's block, holding the indenture papers like a sacred text that had just been defiled. Eleanor watched, her entire being a knot of confusion and a wild, terrifying flicker of hope. The sensation was so foreign she almost recoiled from it. Hope had been a cruel liar for weeks, a phantom that whispered promises in the dark only to vanish at dawn. She did not trust it. She could not afford to. Her body was still braced for the fall of the gavel, for the final sound that would shatter her world. Her muscles were locked, her fingers still digging into the splintery wood of the bench. She felt disconnected from her own limbs, a spectator to a play she could not comprehend. The stranger stopped before the bailiff. His tall frame cast a long shadow back toward the crowd. He reached inside his dark, well-tailored traveler's coat. The movement was smooth, without any hint of haste or agitation. For a terrifying second, a part of Eleanor's mind screamed that he was reaching for a weapon, that this was just another kind of violence, another man asserting his will in this dusty, merciless square. But what emerged was not steel. It was paper. He pulled out a roll of banknotes, thick and tightly bound with a simple string. It was more money than Eleanor had ever seen in one place. It was a fortune. It was a miracle. It was an insult to every moment she had spent scrubbing floors, mending clothes, and counting out pennies for bread. The sight of it made her stomach clench. That simple object, a roll of paper and ink, held the power to destroy a family or to save it. For her, it had only ever been a weapon used against her. Now it was being wielded like a shield. Julian snapped the string with a flick of his thumb. He did not count the bills. He simply extended the thick wad of cash to the bailiff. The full amount of the debt owed by Thomas Vance, he said, his voice as calm and clear as it had been when he first spoke. Plus any associated fees. You will find it is all there. The bailiff, a man accustomed to the predictable miseries of foreclosure and debt, looked completely stunned. He stared at the money, then at the stranger, then at Silas Croft, who was now vibrating with a silent, murderous rage. The bailiff's hand trembled slightly as he reached out and took the cash. It was an act of pure procedural necessity, yet it felt monumental. It felt like the shifting of the entire world on its axis. He began to count, his lips moving silently at first. Then he started separating the bills on the corner of the auctioneer's block, his movements becoming more deliberate, more official. 1 bill, 2, 10, 20. The soft rustle of the paper was the only sound in the square, a counterpoint to the frantic beating of Eleanor's own heart. Each counted bill was a stone being lifted from her chest. She could almost feel the weight lessening, could almost draw a full breath. But she didn't dare, not yet. This could still be a dream. It could be a cruel mirage conjured by her exhausted mind in its final moments of despair. She kept her eyes fixed on the scene, terrified that if she blinked, it would all dissolve back into the nightmare. Silas Croft finally found his voice again, though it was now a low, menacing snarl. "What is this? This is my contract, my settlement." He took another step toward the platform, his gaze fixed on the money as if it were a personal betrayal. "Bailiff, you cannot accept this. The terms were for indenture, not for payment. The time for payment has passed." The bailiff did not look up. He continued his methodical counting, his focus absolute. He was a man of the law, and the law, for all its cruelty, had its own logic. The law allows for a debt to be settled with currency at any point before the final transfer of assets, Silas, he stated, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "You know that as well as I do. The debt is the issue. If the debt is paid, there is no issue." The simple, bureaucratic words struck Silas like a physical blow. He staggered back a step, his face a mask of thwarted greed. He had not wanted the money. Eleanor understood that with a sudden chilling clarity. The money was just the tool. He had wanted the victory. He had wanted her children. He had wanted to stand here in front of the whole town and watch her break. He wanted to own her family's future, to crush the memory of her husband, to grind their name into the dirt. This stranger had not just paid a debt. He had stolen Silas's triumph from his very grasp. And in that moment of suspended action, as the bailiff continued his count and Silas stood defeated, the stranger turned his head. His eyes, sharp and intelligent and the color of gray stone, swept across the small distance of the square and found Eleanor. Their gazes locked. The world fell away. The crowd, the dust, the shame, the fear. All of it dissolved into a blurry periphery. There was only the intense, unwavering focus of this man's eyes. His expression was, as the outline suggested, largely unreadable. There was no smile, no condescending pity, no hint of smugness. But deep within their gray depths, Eleanor saw something she had not seen from anyone in months. It was a flicker of profound empathy. It was not the shallow sympathy of a neighbor who felt bad for her plight. It was something older, deeper. It was a look that said, "I understand this kind of pain." It was a look of shared sorrow, a silent acknowledgement of a heavy burden carried. In that single fleeting moment, she felt seen. Not as the grieving widow, not as the town charity case, not as the debtor's wife, but as Eleanor, a person, a woman fighting an impossible battle. The connection was so sudden, so potent, It sent a jolt through her frozen body. A warmth spread through her chest, a strange and unfamiliar sensation. Her fingers, which had been clenched so tightly around her silver locket, relaxed their death grip. She did not need the memory of Thomas for strength in that second. This stranger's gaze was its own form of anchor in the swirling chaos. Who was he? The question burned in her mind, brighter than her fear. No one in Blackwood had this much money to spare, and certainly no one had the courage to cross Silas Croft so openly, so contemptuously. He was from somewhere else. His clothes, his bearing, his quiet confidence all spoke of a world far beyond the dusty confines of this town. Why would a man like that care about her family? Why would he intervene? The questions were a dizzying spiral, but underneath them was that burgeoning, terrifying hope, now growing stronger, putting down roots in the barren soil of her heart. The bailiff finished his count. He stacked the notes into a neat pile, tapped them on the block to align their edges, and then recounted a second time, more quickly now. A final sharp tap. He gathered the bills into one hand. He looked at Silas, his expression now firm and official. Then he turned to the auctioneer, who stood beside him like a statue, his gavel still held limply in his hand. The entire square leaned in. The silence was stretched to a breaking point. On the platform, little Sarah had stopped crying. She was looking at the stranger, her thumb in her mouth, her wide, innocent eyes full of a child's simple curiosity. Leo stood beside her, his small shoulders squared, a miniature man trying to be brave, his gaze flicking between his mother and the unfolding drama. The bailiff gave a single, sharp nod to the auctioneer. His voice, when he spoke, was not a boom, but a clear, formal declaration that cut through the air with the finality of a judge's ruling. The debt is paid. The Vance indenture is canceled. The words hung in the dusty air, seeming to shimmer in the harsh noon sun. The debt is paid. For a heartbeat, Eleanor did not move, did not breathe. The sentence was a language she no longer understood. It was like hearing a promise of rain in the middle of a desert, a sound so alien it had no meaning. Her mind, braced for the final, shattering blow of the gavel, could not process its absence. The silence that followed was different. It was not the tense, suffocating silence of before, but a hollow, echoing void filled with 1,000 unasked questions. Then, feeling returned to her limbs with a jolt, a painful surge of pins and needles. Her legs, which had been stone just moments ago, suddenly trembled with a desperate, frantic energy. A single primal thought cut through the fog. My children. She pushed herself up from the bench, her vision swimming. The crowd was a blur of muted colors and shocked faces, a painted backdrop to the only thing that was real. Leo, Maya, and Sarah, still standing on that horrible wooden stage, looking small and lost. She ran. It was not a graceful or dignified movement. She stumbled on the uneven ground, her worn leather shoes kicking up clouds of dust. A sob, thick and ragged, tore from her throat, a sound of a cage breaking open. She reached the edge of the platform and her hands slapped against the rough, splintery wood. With a strength she did not know she possessed, she hauled herself onto the stage, her knees scraping, her simple dress catching on a nail. She did not feel the pain. The children saw her then, their tear-streaked faces, frozen in confusion, crumpled into raw, desperate relief. "Mama!" It was Maya's voice, a high, thin wail that pierced Eleanor's very soul. She fell to her knees in the middle of them, her arms wrapping around all three at once, pulling them into a tight, fierce knot of limbs and apologies and love. She buried her face in Leo's shoulder, inhaling the scent of sun and clean cotton and his childish sweat. Her other arm crushed Maya and little Sarah against her side, their small bodies trembling like frightened birds. Tears streamed down her face, hot and unstoppable. They were not the single silent tears of despair she had shed before. These were gasping, shuddering sobs that shook her entire frame, a flood of pent-up grief and terror, and a relief so profound it felt like its own kind of pain. She could not speak. Words were useless, flimsy things. All she could do was hold them, her knuckles white as she clutched the fabric of their shirts. She rocked them back and forth, murmuring their names over and over like a prayer. Leo, Maya, oh, Sarah. Leo, trying to be brave, wrapped his arms around her neck and held on tight, his own sobs muffled against her collar. Maya's face was pressed into her stomach, her small hands twisted in the folds of Eleanor's dress. Little Sarah was crying the loudest, a raw, heartbroken sound that was finally safe to make. Eleanor could feel the dampness of their tears soaking through her clothes, could feel the frantic, rabbit-quick beating of their hearts against her own. She was an anchor in their storm, and they were the only things keeping her from floating away. Her mind was a whirlwind. One moment she was in a black pit, the world ending. The next she was here, the solid warmth of her children in her arms, the sun on her back. It was too much. The whiplash of it left her dizzy and nauseous. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to make it real. She focused on the feeling of Leo's hair under her chin, the sharp bone of Maya's spine, the impossible smallness of Sarah's hand now clutching her finger. They were here. They were safe. They were hers. The thought was so overwhelming, so beautiful. It brought a fresh wave of tears. Around them, the public spectacle began to dissolve. The tense, unified focus of the crowd fractured. A low murmur started at the edges and spread inward, a buzzing wave of gossip and speculation. People turned to their neighbors, their faces alight with a different kind of excitement now. Who was he? Where did he come from? Did you see the look on Silas Croft's face? The whispers were a soundtrack to Eleanor's private miracle. Feet shuffled on the dirt. The heavy scent of sweat and nervous tension began to lift, replaced by the normal, dusty smell of the town square. Some people began to drift away, eager to be the first to spread the news. Others lingered, staring openly, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. The auctioneer, looking bewildered, quietly placed his gavel on his podium, his job abruptly finished. The bailiff, having pocketed the thick roll of bills, gave a short, formal nod and stepped back, his official duty concluded. The world was righting itself, moving on. Eleanor slowly became aware of the sounds beyond her own ragged breathing and her children's cries. She could hear the creak of a wagon wheel, the distant whinny of a horse. The children's sobs were quieting now, turning into hiccuping whimpers. Leo loosened his grip slightly, leaning his head back to look at her. His eyes were red and swollen, but the sheer terror in them was gone, replaced by a weary confusion. "Mama, are we going home now?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Yes, my love," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Yes, we're going home." She kissed his forehead, then Maya's, then Sarah's. She helped them wipe their faces with the hem of her apron, her own hand still shaking. For a long moment, she just stayed there, kneeling on the platform, holding her children, the center of a world that had almost been torn apart. She needed to feel the solid ground beneath her knees, to feel the weight of her children leaning against her. Then, a flicker of movement at the edge of the square caught her eye. Her gaze lifted from her children's beloved faces, searching for the cause of her deliverance. She saw him, the stranger. He stood near the bailiff's table, tall and still, his dark coat a stark silhouette against the bright day. He was the calm center of the storm he had created. He was not looking at her. His attention was fixed on the man standing directly in front of him, a man whose presence radiated pure, undiluted fury. It was Silas Croft. His face, usually florid, was a blotchy, alarming shade of purple. His thick body was tensed, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He stood inches from the stranger, his jaw working as if he were chewing on gravel. Even from across the square, Eleanor could see the venom in his eyes. He was spitting words, his finger jabbing violently toward the stranger's chest. The stranger, in stark contrast, did not move. He stood with a quiet, unshakable stillness, his hands resting calmly at his sides, absorbing the tirade without flinching. The silent, intense drama of their confrontation was a stark counterpoint to the relief washing over her. Her savior, the man who had pulled her and her children back from the brink, was now facing the rage of the man who had pushed them there. The world had shrunk to the space her arms could encircle. Eleanor knelt on the rough wooden planks of the platform, her cheek pressed against the top of Leo's head. The scent of his hair, dusty from the square, filled her senses. Maya was a solid weight against her side, her small fingers still tangled in the fabric of Eleanor's dress. Little Sarah was a warm bundle in her lap, her hiccuping sobs slowly quieting into shuddering breaths. For a moment, there was nothing else. No crowd, no auctioneer, no debt. Just the 3 heartbeats she had fought for, now safe against her own. The wave of relief was so immense it was a physical force, leaving her weak and trembling on the ground. But the silence of the square was not peaceful. It was a vacuum waiting to be filled, and it was filled by the sound of pure, undiluted rage. Eleanor looked up, her gaze drawn past her children. Silas Croft was storming across the dusty ground, his face a mask of fury. His triumph had been stolen from him in the final second, and he looked like a man who had been physically struck. He did not seem to see the dispersing crowd or the stunned bailiff. His eyes were locked on one person only, the stranger, the man who stood near the edge of the platform, his posture calm, his expression unreadable. Silas reached him in a few heavy strides, his boots kicking up clouds of dirt. He didn't stop, didn't hesitate. He lunged forward and grabbed the stranger's arm, his thick fingers digging into the fine wool of the man's coat. The fabric strained under the pressure. "Who are you?" Silas spat, his voice a low, vicious growl that carried across the square. Heads that had been turned away, ready to leave, now snapped back. The gossip had found its second act. "What right do you have to interfere in my business?" Eleanor watched, her own breath caught in her throat. She expected the stranger to flinch, to recoil from the raw aggression. But he did not. He simply looked down at the hand clamped on his arm, then back up at the furious face of Silas Croft. There was no fear in his eyes. There was something else, something that looked like pity. Slowly, deliberately, the stranger took hold of Silas's wrist with his free hand. He did not wrench it away. He simply applied a steady, undeniable pressure. Silas's grip loosened, his fingers unfurling as if against their will. The stranger removed his brother's hand from his coat sleeve and brushed the fabric smooth, a small, almost dismissive gesture. He finally met Silas's enraged glare. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet. It was not meant for the crowd, yet in the tense quiet, every single person heard it. "You should know your own blood, Silas." The words hung in the air, sharp and clear as glass. Eleanor felt a tremor go through her that had nothing to do with relief. Blood? Her mind struggled to connect the two men. Silas with his brutish build and florid, angry face. This stranger, tall and lean, with silver threading his dark hair and an air of quiet authority. She searched their faces looking for a shadow of resemblance. She found it, not in the shape of their maw or the color of their eyes, but in a certain intensity. A stubborn set to their mouths. But where Silas's was twisted with greed and cruelty, this man's was forged in something else, something older and sadder. Silas staggered back a single step, his mouth falling open. His face, which had been flushed with rage, went pale. Recognition warred with disbelief in his eyes. "Julian?" The name was a choked whisper, a ghost on his lips. He looked at the man as if he were seeing an apparition, a specter from a past he had long since buried. "It cannot be. You left. You were gone." "I was," the man, Julian, said simply. He gave his brother one last dismissive look, then turned away. The confrontation was over. Silas was left standing there, suddenly looking smaller, his power stripped away not by money, but by a single name. Julian's attention shifted and his gaze found Eleanor. He walked towards her, his steps sure and steady on the wooden platform that had so nearly been the stage of her ruin. As he drew closer, the hardness in his eyes seemed to dissolve. The sharp, intelligent gaze that had cut through Silas's rage now softened with something that looked like profound empathy. He stopped a few feet from where she knelt with her children. "The crowd, Silas. The whole world seemed to fall away until it was just him and her, and the children nestled between them." Leo and Maya peeked out from the shelter of her arms, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Eleanor swallowed, her throat dry as dust. She tried to find words. "Thank you. Who are you? Why?" The question swirled in her head, a chaotic storm of gratitude and confusion. But no sound would come out. All she could do was look at him, this impossible savior who shared the name of her tormentor. He seemed to understand. He didn't wait for her to speak. "Eleanor Vance?" he asked, his voice gentle now, a stark contrast to the cold command he had used earlier. She could only nod, clutching her children tighter. A flicker of sorrow crossed his face. He looked past her, his gaze distant for a moment, as if seeing a memory superimposed over the dusty square. Thomas was a good man, he said, his voice low and resonant. The sound of her husband's name, spoken with such respect by this stranger, sent a fresh wave of tears to her eyes. She had spent weeks feeling the shame of Thomas's secret, the weight of his mistake. To hear him honored now in this public place was a balm on a wound she thought would never heal. Julian's gaze came back to her, clear and direct. He helped me once, a long time ago. I was just a boy, passing through, and I had nothing. Less than nothing. Your husband gave me work. He gave me a meal and a place to sleep. He asked for nothing in return. Eleanor's mind flashed back, a memory she hadn't thought of in years. Thomas coming home late one evening, his clothes smudged with axle grease, and he told her about a young traveler whose wagon had broken down just outside of town. A solemn young man with old eyes. Thomas had spent 2 days helping him fix it, sharing their food, refusing the few coins the traveler tried to press into his hand. Some people just need a hand up, Eleanor, he had said. You give it when you can. She had forgotten the boy's face, but she had never forgotten her husband's simple decency. I never forgot that kindness, Julian continued, pulling her from her reverie. I told him one day I would repay it. It seems I am many years too late to repay him directly. His eyes drifted to Leo and Maya, and a deep sadness settled in his features. But a debt of honor is still a debt. This is just a debt repaid. He said it so simply, as if paying a fortune to save a family from ruin was a common transaction. For Silas, debt was a weapon, a tool for power and humiliation. For his brother, it was a matter of honor, a promise kept across decades. The two men were made of entirely different earth. Eleanor finally found her voice, though it was little more than a whisper. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Julian replied. He looked down at her, still kneeling on the planks, a fortress of weary flesh and bone around her children. He saw her exhaustion, the faint tremor in her hands, the streaks of dust and tears on her face. Then he did something that surprised her more than the money, more than the revelation of his name. He bent slightly and offered his hand to her. It was not a handshake. It was not a gesture of charity. His palm was open, facing up. An invitation. It was an offer to help her stand. For weeks she had been on her knees, figuratively and now literally. She had knelt before Silas Croft, before the pastor, before God. She had been brought low by grief, by poverty, by shame. Now a hand was reaching down, not to push her further, but to lift her up. Her gaze fell to his hand. It was a strong hand, clean, with long fingers. It was nothing like Silas's thick, calloused paws. It was the hand of a man who worked with his mind, but it did not look soft. It looked capable. Hesitantly, she lifted her own hand, which was trembling. Her fingers were cold, and her skin was rough from work and worry. She placed her hand in his. The moment her skin touched his, a jolt went through her. It was not a spark of attraction, but a jolt of simple, profound human warmth. The strength in his grip was firm, but gentle. It grounded her. It was a silent message that passed through that simple touch. You are not alone. You can get up now. That single respectful contact sent a wave of heat through her weary body, a current of life in the midst of her emotional ruin. His hand was a firm anchor in the swirling chaos of her emotions. For a moment, Eleanor simply stood there, supported by Julian Croft. The furious shouts of his brother, Silas, had faded to a low growl. The crowd, their curiosity satisfied, began to drift away, leaving the vast square feeling strangely empty. Julian released her hand slowly. He turned to her children, who were still clinging to her dress, their faces streaked with tears. His sharp gray eyes, which held such authority moments before, softened with a startling gentleness. He knelt slightly, not speaking to them, but simply acknowledging their fear with a silent promise that the danger had passed. Leo puffed out his small chest and stared back, while Maya hid deeper in her mother's skirt. Without a word, Julian began to walk, setting a slow, deliberate pace that Eleanor could easily match. He was not leading her, but walking with her. It was a quiet act of protection. Eleanor gathered her children and fell into step beside him. She could feel Silas Croft's gaze burning into her back, a physical weight of pure hatred. She did not look back. That life had ended the moment the gavel was raised. The walk to her cottage was filled with a profound silence. What could she possibly say? Thank you felt like a pebble offered in exchange for a mountain. She remembered her husband Thomas speaking once of a young man he'd helped, a runaway with nothing. Thomas had given him his own spare coat and the last of their travel money years ago. She never imagined such a simple kindness would circle back to save them all. She risked a glance at Julian's profile. He had a strong jaw with silver at his temples and lines of sorrow etched around his eyes. He carried himself like a man who had seen too much of the world, yet there was no arrogance in his posture, only a deep, settled calm. As they reached the weathered gate of her small homestead, the familiar scent of lavender from her garden filled the air. Julian stopped at her door, the peeling paint and worn threshold looking precious. Her children, sensing safety, immediately rushed inside, their small voices finally returning. Eleanor remained on the doorstep, facing him. The afternoon sun cast long shadows, and in the golden light, she could see the exhaustion in his face too. I have nothing, she began, her voice a raw whisper. I don't know how I can ever repay you. He simply shook his head. You owe me nothing, Eleanor. Thomas gave me a coat when I was freezing. He asked for nothing in return. Some debts are not about money. His gaze met hers, and she saw not just empathy but a shared understanding of loss. Then he reached inside his traveler's coat. This time he produced a thick, sealed envelope and pressed it into her hand. It was heavy, the paper clean and crisp. Her fingers, calloused from work, felt clumsy holding it. What is this? She asked, her heart beginning a slow, heavy beat against her ribs. A new beginning, he said, his voice leaving no room for refusal. He would have wanted you to have a fighting chance, not just to survive, but to live. His fingers brushed against hers as he let go. The brief touch sent a jolt of warmth through her, a current of life in a body that had felt numb for so long. Before she could protest, he turned and gave a final small nod. Then he started walking away, down the dusty track that led back to the world he had come from. He did not look back. Eleanor stood frozen in her doorway, the heavy envelope in one hand. She watched him go, his form getting smaller until he was just a silhouette against the setting sun. She backed into her cottage and closed the door, the familiar click of the latch sounding final. Her children were in the main room, already pulling out their wooden toys, their future bought and paid for on a dusty auction block. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal on the envelope. Inside was not a letter, just money. A stack of clean bills, far thicker than the one he had given the bailiff. It was enough to fix the roof, enough for winter coats, enough to breathe. A single sob of sheer relief escaped her lips. The crushing weight that had been on her chest for months finally lifted. She sank into a chair, laying the money out before her. She touched it, half believing it would vanish. She then opened the tarnished silver locket at her neck, looking at Thomas's kind, smiling face. "Oh, Thomas," she whispered to the tiny portrait. "You saved us. Even now, you saved us." The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and rose. Eleanor walked back to the doorway and opened it to the cooling night air. She looked out at the empty road where Julian Croft had disappeared. The future was unknown and terrifying, but for the first time since Thomas passed, fear was not the only thing she felt.